Welcome to T is for Trauma. I'm your host, David O'Connor. My guest today is Hannah Albracht, and Hannah actually has a connection to a previous guest of the podcast, Becca DeRoeck of episode number 3, in that she is Becca's eldest sister. However, Hannah has a very different story to Becca, and this episode focuses more on the pressure she felt being the first child in an ultra-religious household, and then her experiences later in life with workplace bullying. Hannah talks about coming of age during the height of purity culture, how the messaging with which she was raised undermined her relationship with her spouse and to herself, and how workplace bullying created an acute feeling of imposter syndrome for her early on in her career. Hannah's story is one that I think will resonate with a lot of people, and I really appreciate the vulnerability with which she shares it. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Hannah Albracht. Welcome to the show, Hannah.
Thank you.
I like to start off every episode with gratitude. And in this case, you are the oldest sister of Becca DeRoeck, who appeared in episode number 3. And in this instance, my gratitude is for the opportunity to demonstrate how trauma can influence people within the same family in completely different ways, and to showcase that experience and the variety within that. So I really appreciate you showing up today to tell that story.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited.
So for people who might not have heard Becca's episode, where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Sweden, Stockholm, Sweden, which is the capital. So Becca was 10 when we moved, and I was 12 when we moved.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where did you move to?
We moved to the Bay Area in California and lived there for 3 years. So I was there for my middle school years. And then halfway through 9th grade, we moved to Texas, to the Austin area.
And how would you describe your childhood?
My childhood in Sweden, I would describe as pretty idyllic. We got to spend a lot of time outside and in nature, which, I don't know, it's been a large part of forming me, I think. I still feel like a very deep connection to nature, and I feel homesick a lot for the nature in Sweden because it's very different than here.
Yeah.
Especially in Texas, it's like too hot to go outside for more than half the year, and so I miss just being able to walk outside. And we have what's called allemansrätt, which means any person can be anywhere in nature. You know, there's no such thing as a no trespassing sign because it's all
I love that.
available. So that's really cool. So that was a big part of my childhood. And then I had my sisters, and I had a lot of friends and, family. So in that way, I had a pretty wonderful childhood. I went to a small school, and just my parents, we did not have a lot of money, but we never realized that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was good.
You're the oldest of 3 sisters?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So my youngest sister, she was 8 when we moved.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And in terms of that transition to the U.S., it's a pretty big change. What was that like for you?
That was almost traumatic in its own way. Because I did want to move. My favorite show growing up was Full House. And so I thought when we moved to California, we were going to live in San Francisco in one of those, tall, skinny, beautiful homes with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge. And that was not the case at all. I was like, I've been gypped on this. So that's not how it turned out. In moving from a very small town with, there were 3 kids in my first grade class at my little private school in Sweden, and then moving to a big American public school, that was hard. And it's interesting because part of my story, has to do with workplace bullying. I also got bullied by teachers in middle school.
Oh, interesting.
And so I did have a very hard transition to the U.S. It got much better when we moved to Texas. People are a lot friendlier here. No offense to Californians. It could have just been the middle school Californians that I met. Because I know a lot of Californians who are perfectly lovely, but the middle school experience for me and the culture shock were pretty intense. Yeah.
I know in Becca's episode, she had mentioned that your family was very religious.
Yes. That part of the childhood was not as good, not as enjoyable.
If I'm remembering correctly, it was Mennonite?
My dad grew up Mennonite. His mom grew up Amish. And so we still have a lot of Amish and Mennonite family. So he grew up, very conservative. No TV allowed, a lot of church and a lot of, strict religious doctrine.
Yeah.
My mom did not grow up Mennonite. She grew up secular, but she and her mom, I can't remember if I think my grandma found religion first. I'm not sure the story there, how she became religious, but I think she was maybe in her 20s or 30s. And then my mom became religious when she was a teenager.
Gotcha.
And she kind of embraced it very fully. Like, she was really big into music, and she took all her records and gave them away because they were secular.
Yeah.
She was really into disco, and she got rid of all her disco records. She had Ringo Starr's autograph, and she gave it away because that's a secular musician. So she was very strict,
Yeah.
And my dad came from something very strict, and so ours growing up felt that way too.
So what did that look like for you as a child to grow up inside that very religious system?
It's interesting because there was always a lot of tension there because my parents are educated and they're very much the type of people who ask a lot of questions. And we were raised and encouraged to ask questions. We would have dinner table debates, and we were allowed to criticize, question anything. There was nothing we weren't allowed to talk about. Our parents would never be like, "Oh, we can't bring that up,"
Yeah.
We were fully allowed to just, be curious, and my parents would answer questions. And so there's a tension with that in the type of Christianity we were raised in that is very literal, and, doubting is sinful, and, the Bible is inerrant, and,
Yeah.
So there's that cultural strictness of Christianity with the tension of our home that I think maybe always pulled at me,
Mm-hmm.
because I always wanted to know the truth, and my parents too, and my sisters too. We were always asking questions and trying to figure out the truth. And I think the more you do that, the more at odds you get with a religion like evangelical
When you say
Christianity.
the truth, do you mean broadly or in relation specifically to religion?
Broadly.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
But also, since religion was so important to us, it became a lot about that. We
Sure.
had a lot of conversations about, hell, and I grew up reading a lot of books about the Holocaust and slavery and Native Americans because it was just, I connected with those types of books. And so I grew up reading about, people being treated horribly, and so questions of that kind of thing, and Becca's very interested in that kind of stuff too.
Yeah.
So we were just always asking questions, how can these types of things happen, and do these people go to hell, And there was no question that we weren't allowed to ask,
Yeah. Do you think there's any parallel there between this mistreatment you were experiencing at school and then also these stories of mistreatment at a broad scale? I mean,
that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, do you think that's maybe what made you gravitate towards those stories?
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. I guess I always have been very sensitive to the mistreatment of other people. And having experienced it myself, I do feel like a kinship with people who are, downtrodden and hurting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the values or rules that you had to follow in growing up under this very strong religious belief? What did that look like for you?
So we did, go to church every Sunday. And when we were older, our youth group every week. We were very involved at church. My dad was traveling a lot. So when we moved to the Bay Area, we spent a lot of time at church and became very involved. And that church was very conservative. And the church we went to in Sweden was very, what's the word? It's not Pentecostal. I'll have to look it up later. But very charismatic. That's the word. Charismatic. It was a very charismatic church we went to in Sweden. So speaking in tongues, falling down in the front of the room, a lot of that kind of hullabaloo.
Yeah.
Which to a child is very strange.
Yeah.
Even though I grew up with it, I always was like, this is weird.
Yeah, I'm sure you had a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, this is weird. But we had Bible study. We studied the Bible as a family. We read Bible stories every night before bed. And prayer was huge for me. I don't know about my sisters, but prayer was like my main outlet for stress and anxiety.
Yeah.
And I was plagued by a very guilty conscience growing up. So anytime I did anything remotely bad, I would have to pray for forgiveness. And it was like this constant nagging,
Yeah.
So praying for forgiveness, praying for Jesus to come into my heart every night, because I was always scared that it wasn't going to stick, It was a lot of that. And I don't know if that came from my parents or from church, because I don't remember explicitly hearing those messages, but I must have gotten them from somewhere.
Yeah, I'm sure that translated to a lot of shame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And then in terms of being the oldest sister, was there a lot of pressure to be a role model?
Yeah, there was. Especially as I got older, high school, college, when you kind of go off on your own. And our parents were quite protective of us, so we weren't allowed to date until we were teenagers. I was never really allowed to go to the mall with my friends or, really be out and about on my own. And my parents have said, it's because they grew up hearing America is dangerous, and so when we moved here, they were a lot more protective of us than other people's parents were.
Yeah.
So when we all got to college and had more independence, I felt a lot of pressure, and my parents told me, your sisters are watching you. You need to be an example for them.
Yeah.
And so you already feel, as a Christian, like someone's always watching you, waiting for you to mess up, and then knowing that your sisters are watching you too, even though they actually were not.
Yeah.
But that's what so there was pressure for me, absolutely, to just be very perfect.
So was dating and any kind of relationship just completely outlawed when you were a teenager?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we were not allowed to date till we were 16. And we argued with our parents a lot about it. And my mom wanted us to not date until we were 18. But my dad managed to talk her down to 16.
Yeah.
But by 16, you've already gone through puberty and you're already having all these feelings. And I was interested in boys from a very young age. I had big crushes in kindergarten.
Okay.
And so I went through years of trying to suppress that, because I was like, if I like a boy and he likes me, what am I going to do? I'm not allowed to date. So I'm not allowed. I can't make myself seem available,
Yeah.
And so I had to do everything I could to just make myself very just standoffish, I guess, to the opposite sex.
Right.
And so by the time I was allowed to date, I was terrified to hold a guy's hand or kiss a guy, or it was the scariest thing on earth.
Before you had reached that 16-year-old threshold, were there any instances where a guy had engaged you and you had to back off, or kind of like an awkward situation there?
Yeah, there were. But because I was so awkward and bad at talking to guys, it kind of fizzled by itself.
Right.
Becca had more problems because she was always very charming and outgoing. And so she had boys come into the house to convince my dad to let her date them.
Oh, wow.
I never had that problem.
You had mentioned off mic that all this had kind of been going on during the time of purity culture.
Yeah.
And that is not something I, as someone who didn't grow up in the U.S., was really familiar with. Can you kind of explain what that is or was?
Yes. It started in, don't quote me on this, but I think late 80s, early 90s is when purity culture kind of began to take a hold in churches in America. It's a very American phenomenon. And it's all based on getting girls to be pure. It's not focused as much on boys or men. It's really focused a lot on girls. So as one of 3 girls, I definitely got caught up in it. And I don't really remember hearing explicit messaging about being pure, other than my parents, like, you're not allowed to date, I got the idea, okay, dating is bad for some reason. Yeah. And being with the opposite sex is bad for some reason. And definitely, like, the way you dress needs to be modest and all that. But there was this, it kind of started with this young guy named Joshua Harris. He wrote a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And it, like, swept the nation and was read by youth groups all over the place. And my mom tried to get me to read it. And I was like, no, I'm not reading this book. But I definitely got swept up in its message, which is that you are designed to get married. That is the goal of any dating relationship. And so dating for fun is not a thing. Dating just to get to know a person is not a thing. Like, you date with the intent of marriage.
Wow.
And so when I started dating, as soon as I felt like, okay, this guy might not be someone I want to get married, I started feeling like it just puts a lot of pressure on that relationship. Absolutely. To be really good, because this is someone you're going to marry. And I got the message too that there's one person for you. There's one soulmate. God has this one person for you. And so every person you date could potentially be this one person that God has for you, but you need to figure it out. And don't get too close in case it's not, Yeah. And I met a guy in college. I dated a few guys, but I never connected with Christian guys. I always connected with, like, atheist guys or agnostic guys. Agnostic, atheist people in general, actually. I had a hard time getting along with other Christians. But I could not date, outside the faith. Because there's the Bible verse, you have to be equally yoked. And that's part of purity culture too, But it's the main thing, I went off on a tangent, is, keep yourself pure. No sex. Absolutely no sex. Barely any touching. And if you do any of those things, you're dirty or shameful.
Right.
Do not show off your body. Do not be proud of your body. Do not feel good about your body. Do not be good at kissing, Yeah. It basically suppress every sexual urge you have, because sex is meant for marriage. And if you're not getting married, you shouldn't be doing or feeling those things. So it's a very damaging message,
Absolutely, yeah.
And it leads to you having a bad relationship with your body or no relationship with your body. Like, on my wedding night, I had no idea what sex was like. Like, I had no idea what I was doing. And I didn't even know my own body, And I was 23 years old. And that's what purity culture leads to, is like a hostile relationship with your own body and sexuality.
Yeah, and a suppression of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can remember being vaguely aware of this living in Ireland, and mid 90s, I'm fairly certain, is right around when Britney Spears popped on the scene.
Uh-huh.
And she was in a very high profile relationship at the time with Justin Timberlake. And obviously she's being marketed as this sex symbol, but then also they were very vocal about, oh, we're waiting until marriage, like we're maintaining our virginity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if I'm remembering correctly, there was a couple of other celebrities at the time who were kind of on this same page. And it seems like it was a swing of the pendulum to the other side after kind of like the raucous times of the 80s, like the partying and whatnot. And it was very confusing as an outsider to kind of see all of this stuff going on. And I was probably not even at puberty at the time when this stuff started to be discussed, and I was like, wow, this seems so interesting, but also like so completely foreign, because people were not on that same page in Ireland. And I think the amount, it's very difficult to describe, because the Ireland I grew up in was incredibly religious, but in a very different way to the US, where people are very, very vocally religious and vocal about their values that they derive from religion in the US. And it was just very confusing to see all of that. And I can only imagine being that age and actually living with that and living with those values. It must have been just so difficult to navigate.
Yeah. Yeah. We had to, sign purity contracts in youth group.
What is that?
It's a piece of paper they give you basically that you sign saying you're not going to give your body to anyone until marriage. Some places take it further. They do like purity balls where you dance with your dad. They do purity rings, purity this, purity that. It was like a cottage industry, really.
Yeah.
My church did not go that far, but the damaging message definitely still got through.
Yeah.
Maybe it would have been better if they had gone far, because then I could have been like, okay, this is crazy. But because it was so more casual, I guess, less serious, it was maybe more insidious, because it felt less like it was coming from these people and more like it was coming from actually God,
Yeah. You had mentioned your wedding night. When did you meet your now husband?
We met in college. So we both went to Texas State. So we met in 2007. And he was an atheist at the time. And I was a very devoted Christian at the time.
Yeah.
I kind of, I left home and immediately, at the encouragement of my mom and my parents, joined the Christian organizations at school and made friends with Christian people. But I loved debating the Bible and talking about spiritual things, and those dinner time conversations I had with my family, I wanted to continue those with my peers.
Yeah.
And my husband Jordan, he grew up evangelical Christian just like I did, but he left that religion in high school. And so he and I loved to talk and debate, and he was very interested in all of that, and so was I. So we kind of bonded, over talking about things.
Yeah, I was curious about that, given that he was atheist at the time. He was still open to having those discussions and those conversations.
Mm-hmm, definitely. He was always searching, and part of the thing I hate the most about the evangelical Christianity that I grew up with is that you see every person as a potential convert,
Yeah.
Every friend you make, every person you meet, is a potential that to convert, to Christianity. And there's a lot of pressure. That's where, the term evangelical comes from. You have to be evangelizing all the time.
Right.
And so there was a ton of pressure that I felt to pray for my friends, bring my friends to church, convert them to Christianity. And because I connected so well with people who were not Christians, that's like, it was a huge point of pressure for me. And so part of me, talking to Jordan was also hoping to bring him back.
Yeah.
And, I have my old prayer journal, and his name is, written in it along with all my other friends.
Did he know about that at the time?
No.
Okay.
No.
So you had mentioned having to wait till 16, and then also all of this kind of puritanical programming working in the background.
Yeah.
What was it like dating Jordan in the like beginning stages, and kind of like how did that relationship progress? Like what were the challenges?
Yeah, so I had dated a few guys before Jordan, and the guy before Jordan like was the first guy I ever said I love you to, and he said I love you to me, and I was like, okay, ding ding ding, this is it. We're going to get married.
Yeah.
Cuz that's what that's what I believe. The first person you love is your soulmate that God has for you, and you're going to get married. But that relationship, was full of problems, and I stuck with it because I was like, well, this is who God wants me to marry. And then when I finally realized, no, this is not it, that's when I started hanging out with Jordan.
Yeah.
At first, he was just meant to be my rebound, and I was kind of his rebound too, because he had gotten out of a long relationship. And I was like, this guy's not a Christian. I can't marry him.
Right.
But I really like him a lot, and we had been friends for a while, but it was always kind of flirty friends,
Yeah.
So we just started hanging out and talking, but there was so much guilt, on my part for wanting to be with Jordan when he wasn't a Christian.
Yeah.
And I had experienced it with a couple other guys that I had dated too, who weren't Christian. I was always trying to turn all these guys Christian so I could date them, which looking back is, terrible. But I couldn't find a Christian guy to date, so I just didn't connect with those guys.
And it's what you knew at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's embarrassing looking back now, but yeah, so I was praying to God, please let Jordan come back and become a Christian so we can be together, and
right.
Also so he doesn't have to go to hell. That's always a little side perk there.
And what about from his side? Like, was he fully on board with you having this as your value system?
He wasn't at first because of his bad experiences with the church.
Yeah.
And then I wrote a blog post that I put on my blog in college, that expressed my relationship with Jesus and why I was a Christian. And it was all about helping other people. And he read that and it resonated with him a lot. And he told me, when I read that, I knew you were the type of Christian that I could be with.
Yeah.
And he was even willing to go to church with me. We found a cool little hipster church in East Austin that we went to. And he eventually did find his way back to Christianity. And I was like, wow, this is miraculous. God has answered my prayers. And then ironically, we moved in opposite directions.
Yeah. There was an inversion, right?
Yeah. So on our honeymoon, for example, I was crying because he told me he didn't believe in the virgin birth, and he didn't believe necessarily that Jesus was literally, sacrificed on a cross. He believed more metaphorically in the Bible. And I was distraught, but the more Jordan and I talked, the more I started coming around to his side of things, and the more I experienced life, the more and more things I started to question.
Yeah.
And so we have never seen eye to eye spiritually, and still don't.
Yeah. You had mentioned still being a virgin on your wedding night.
Yeah.
What was that experience like? I'm sure it was incredibly challenging to take this next step at 23 years old.
Yes. I do not recommend waiting till your wedding night, especially with how much the church builds and builds to that wedding night. You know, like in purity culture, a girl's purpose is to find a man and get married, you know, and the culminating event of that process is your wedding night, which is supposed to be like pure marital sexual bliss. You know, that's what we're led to believe. Because if you wait for the right person, your God ordained person, then sex will be amazing. And I didn't even see it as something physical. I saw it as something like more spiritual. And I was like, my body parts will just know what to do, you know? And that was not the case at all. Like, and, you know, Jordan had not been with a whole lot of people either, because he also was raised in the same religion. And, you know, that kind of, it still affects you, even though he left, you know, the faith and was an atheist. The way you're raised, you know, impacts you. So he also was not super experienced. And so, like, I had no idea what to do. And he had no idea that I had no idea what to do.
Right.
So, he's like the most patient, wonderful person. And, you know, our relationship didn't suffer in that way, but it sucks to get to that place that you've been waiting for and you've been promised will be so amazing, and then it's like it's not, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I've never had to think about this before, but is there any sort of kind of like coaching, given that you are the messaging is to wait, you know, and it puts a lot of pressure then on the event itself. Like, is there any kind of coaching to prepare you for that, or kind of like literature? No,
none at all. My friend who is still a Christian and was one of my best friends in high school. She read some books beforehand that she recommended to me, but I was like, I don't need books. Like, this is going to be amazing.
Yeah.
So maybe there is, but I never received anything like that. You know, I went into completely blind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think most people's experience with their first time is generally not positive, because, you know, like there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of anxiety, et cetera, and then especially and then also like your first time with a new partner, you don't know anything about each other's bodies, or like kind of what the turn-ons and stuff like that are. And I'd imagine having this pressure with the person who is now your partner for the rest of your life, and then it not being not so much that it's not a positive experience, but it has been sold to you as it's going to be this wonderful, joyous experience, and then to have an experience that goes the opposite way that must be really tough to manage, because it's like, oh, this is my person, but this thing was not what it was billed to be.
Yeah.
I'm sure the propensity would be to go internal and go, oh, is it something wrong with me?
Yeah. Yeah. And I didn't even know my body. Like, I had been repressing everything and avoiding my own body for so long. Like, this, maybe it's TMI. You can cut it if you need to. But I had never like even used a tampon. Like,
right.
I was so scared of my own body.
Yeah.
You know, that it was painful. You know, it's painful. It's shameful. And I could not be intimate with my husband without feeling shame and feeling disgust with myself. You know, anytime like I felt good sexually, I would feel disgusted with myself after.
Wow.
Because that's how I was raised. You know, like, sex is sinful, disgusting. It's what people in the world do. Christians don't do it, you know?
Yeah.
Until you're married, and then it's different, but it's not.
Yeah.
You know?
And did that persist on into the relationship?
Oh, yeah. It still persists. Honestly, we've been married 11 years, and it's been hard the whole way. It's part of why I went back to started going to therapy this year.
Yeah.
Because it's, you know, I was 23 when I got married, and I'm 34 now. So more than half my life, I was programmed like this, and it's very hard to get over.
Yeah. And how has therapy helped with that? Like, kind of, what has been some of the insights that have been helpful in dealing with it?
I haven't really gotten to explore that yet in therapy. I've been exploring more like the workplace bullying that I experienced.
Right.
But my husband and I went to marriage counseling just to work on our relationship. And I think that is very helpful, just working on your relationship with each other.
Yeah.
Because before you can have good intimacy, you do need to have a good relationship. And after 11 years, there's always things to work on, with your spouse. So,
Right.
but I'm working through, the anxiety and the shame and the guilt that I felt is something I'm working through. And I'm hoping it will help me get over all this, shame stuff and get over the trauma of like losing your religion. Like, that's a big deal,
Yeah.
to just not have God anymore after having him for so long.
Yeah. And, especially when you've been given this very permissive set of rules and no substitute system for how to do things better, bringing in the guidance of a professional seems like a great route to take.
Yes, because before when I had a problem, I would just lay down in bed at night and pray. And I still at night, I get the urge to pray and I have to stop myself and be like, no, don't pray.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to have a relationship with that God anymore.
Yeah.
If there is a loving God, then that's great. But the God I had a relationship with, I don't want a relationship with anymore. So now I take those concerns to my therapist instead.
Yeah.
And that is a wonderful thing to have. I feel very fortunate that I can afford therapy and make time to go to therapy. It's so important.
Yeah. You had mentioned leaving your religion behind. What did that process look like for you? Or what was the tipping point?
The tipping point was definitely 2020, which I'm sure doesn't surprise anyone just hearing that. But I think it started before I realized it had started. But 2020 was the year when I finally realized, like, I don't think I believe anymore. And I wasn't ready to say it out loud. And every time I would talk about it, I would start to cry. Like, I couldn't even face the idea for a while. But that's when it started. The race riots in the summer were a huge thing because I'm a huge believer in social justice, and racism has been something I've been very passionate about like my whole life. And when this became like brought to national consciousness, and I realized like really it's my privilege that has given me a really good life, not God, you know? That was part of it, but the whole sex thing was the main catalyst because I realized if they were wrong about this purity thing, which was like the thing I rested my faith on and the thing the church urged and stressed over and over and over. If they were wrong about that, they must be wrong about so many other things, And so when I realized that, everything else kind of fell apart around it. I kind of, I like to write. So I've been writing to kind of process all of it. And I wrote that like, it was like a puzzle piece, came out of like the middle of the puzzle and the rest of the puzzle just fell apart around it, the whole sex thing, because it was such a focus,
Yeah, absolutely.
Like my college roommate, she was a very involved, devoted Christian. And, I would bring a boyfriend home and we'd be cuddling on the couch and she would shame me,
Wow.
Yeah, she'd be like, have you been making out? Why are you guys that close? Doesn't that make you turned on? And like, would make me feel so guilty for having normal physical relationships,
Yeah.
And they were very tame, but yeah, I kept hearing it from my peers, from the church, from everywhere. And so it was huge focus of my beliefs.
You have alluded several times to your time as a teacher, and as all of this was playing out in terms of getting married and progressing your relationship with your now husband, you were also experiencing some struggles as a teacher.
Yeah.
And when did you start teaching?
In 2010.
Okay.
So I graduated college in December of 2009, and I became a teacher in August of 2010. And then my husband and I got married in May of 2011, June of 2011. So he was with me for my first year of teaching.
Yeah.
And supported me a lot. But yeah, that's when I started, was 2010.
And what subjects or grades did you teach?
I started in 5th grade. I taught 5th grade for 3 years, and I taught social studies, science, math, and language arts in Spanish and in English.
Gotcha.
And then, so that was my first 3 years, and then my second 2 years, I don't know how that came out weird. So first 3 years, and then last 2 years of my first stint into teaching, I taught kindergarten.
Gotcha. And where did the trouble start?
It started kind of right away. So I had been bullied, in middle school by my teachers. But it was not like really systemic, continued. So I don't know if you would call it bullying, but just, mistreatment basically.
Yeah.
And sometimes by kids. I was not like very confident or outgoing growing up. I was pretty shy, and so I think I was a little bit of a target, because of that. And then when I became a teacher, I was very young. I was only 22, pretty much fresh out of college, and teaching's a job with a very big learning curve. It's not easy. So I guess being new and young kind of made me a target for the principal I had at the time. And I also happened to be very good at my job. I had, like, the kids and the parents loved me. I connected really well with the kids. I had very good classroom management. I had excellent test scores even my first year. And so I think that, coupled with, like, how young and new I was, my principal just, like, honed in on me for some reason.
So that high performance was actually a source of conflict for her?
I think so. Because one of the things that stood out to me that she said was, when I was a new teacher, I worked till 9 p.m. every night. Why are you leaving on time every day?
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. But it started, she kind of gaslit me in the first time we even talked on the phone, because I had my interview, which was excellent. It went really well. She was very nice. She was very friendly. And then when she called me a few weeks later, she said, "Oh, we've made a hiring decision. We've submitted your info to HR. We're so excited, but we're not hiring you." And then she hung up the phone.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I was like shocked. I was like, "What just happened?"
Yeah.
Like, the whole phone call made it sound like I had been chosen for the position, and then she goes, "But you're not who we're gonna hire." And then she hung up the phone before I could even respond.
That's insane.
So it felt like it was on purpose.
Yeah.
But she's also not a native English speaker, so I was like, maybe I just misunderstood her, or she expressed herself in a way that she didn't mean to. And then she called me a few weeks later and said their number one choice had a problem with their background check, and so I ended up getting hired. And everything was great for the first 6 weeks of school. And then all of a sudden she called me in her office and just berated me and yelled at me and told me that I don't love my kids. I don't care about them. There's no way I'm going to be a successful teacher. Basically just, like, tore me apart.
Wow.
And it just continued. She was a principal there for 2 more years, and it was constant.
Was there something that happened at 6 weeks that kind of catalyzed that?
So she came in my classroom, and I was giving a spelling test instead of teaching a math lesson. And she had a problem with that. And I explained, I was just trying to catch up because we had gotten off track with our schedule. And I knew I was supposed to be teaching math at that time, but I really needed to make up the spelling test because we had an assembly or something that got in the way. That kind of thing happened a lot. And so part of being a teacher, you got to kind of be flexible with your schedule sometimes and meet the needs of the kids. And, so first she was upset with that. And then she called me in her office and, was upset because I hadn't started this reading program that I was supposed to start. But my training program and the district provided trainings had told me to start it at 6 weeks, the first day of the 6 weeks. And the day she called me in her office was the first day of that 6 week.
Oh.
And on my lesson plan, it said I was going to start the program. And I was. She called me in first thing in the morning, so I hadn't started it yet. But she wouldn't listen. She wouldn't let me talk. She just went right into attacking my character, and me as a person. So I think she was just looking for a reason.
I'm sure as a new teacher, you were probably second guessing, like, hey, am I screwing up here? Like, does this person have valid criticisms? Like, am I in the wrong?
Oh, absolutely. Especially when it wouldn't stop.
Yeah.
She got this huge task force of people assigned to me to help me because I was such a shitty teacher, in her opinion. And I actually ended up getting a lot of good help from very, very nice, wonderful people. Because a lot of people in the district were truly there to help teachers. And so I got a lot of help, and my test scores at the end of the year were the best in this whole district. But she said, you only got these test scores because of all the help you got, not because you are actually a good teacher. And so I just kept hearing that messaging. And then the next year, she was still my principal. And I had a student in my class who was really, really struggling a lot. And I worked very hard with his mom and the other people at my school to get him tested for special education.
Yeah.
It took the entire school year, and it was me working nonstop. And she, at the end of the year, accused me of not doing enough for this student. And she said I didn't communicate enough with his parents and all this stuff, even though I was meeting with them every 2 weeks. It was just crazy. So she made me always question myself, and I started feeling like I must really be a fraud. Like, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to be teaching.
Yeah.
And it just got inside of my head, and I wasn't even conscious about it until I went to therapy, that this was the message that was in my head. And now I'm in my 10th year of teaching, and I still, at the beginning of every year, I feel this intense anxiety and fear that this is the year that they're going to figure out that I'm actually not a good teacher.
Right.
And
that imposter syndrome.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've just been getting by this whole time, but I'm not actually supposed to be here doing this,
Yeah.
So definitely it affected how I viewed myself in a really bad way.
Yeah. In a school system, and I'm not that familiar with it, but it seems like the principal, at least at that school, is at the top of the food chain.
Yes.
Is there resources available to you that you can pursue when a principal is acting maliciously like that?
Sort of, but not really, because in Texas we don't have teachers unions. We just have the associations. So teachers can pay for it, and we can get legal representation if someone does something, unlawful. But just workplace bullying, that's not something they really handle.
Gotcha.
And I had a principal who actually bullied me even worse my 3rd year, and I did file a grievance against her with HR, but they had her word against mine, and they chose to go with hers. So not really, no. Yeah. There's really not. And as a teacher, you can't even apply to work at a different school, because if you leave before your contract's over, then the state takes away your license. And you can apply for a transfer to another school, which I did, but the principal has to approve that transfer. Yeah. And so my principal didn't approve it, and so I was stuck at that school.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
How did the situation play out with the first principal?
So the first year, she refused to get me. I did an alternative certification program. And so at the end of the program and the end of my first year, she had to sign off to recommend me for my certification. And when I started having all the problems with her, I talked to my program and I said, look, I'm being targeted by my principal. This is what's happening. And they said, oh, no worries. Document everything she's doing. But know that her recommendation is just a small part of this process, and it's not the end all be all. And so I heard document everything, and I did. Like, I documented everything. And when she gave me a very bad evaluation at the end of the year, I took that documentation and I plopped it on her desk, and I was like, I want you to read this before I sign this. I'm not going to sign this. And she fixed my evaluation, and so it was positive. And so I thought, because of that, and also she included me in like a graduation ceremony with the other teachers, because I was graduating from my program and getting my certification.
Yeah.
And so then I go one day and I look in my box, and there's a piece of paper, and it's the paperwork for my certification. And she had checked the box that said, yes, I'm recommending you for certification. And then she had scratched it out and checked no. And without talking to me, without giving me any sort of heads up, she put that in my box. And I was like in a panic, and I went to the woman who had been supporting me, the district person who had been supporting me and helping me with my first year. And I said, what's going on? And she said, oh, it must have been a mistake. Look, she scratched it out. It's a mistake, I'm sure. Just take it to her and ask. And I took it to her. It was not a mistake at all. But my program, after I submitted all the documentation that I had taken, they did recommend me for certification. So I got my certification, and then I went back the next year, and I was very scared, that she would retaliate against me, because I had kind of gone around her to get certified. But she didn't. She didn't retaliate, but she still gave me a really hard time that school year. It was extremely stressful, because she questioned everything I did, and she always gave me a bad evaluation, and she just made up stories, and so it was rough. So at the end of that year, at the end of that year, she had been at our school for about 5 years, and people were catching on, and she had been bullying other people too.
Right.
And so people were becoming more and more aware. And we kind of went as a staff and complained about her and got her moved to a different school.
Gotcha.
But she never got fired.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it seems like, especially when it comes to the school system, once people obtain a certain position of authority, that it's very hard to get them out of the system.
Yeah. Can't dynamite them out of there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So in terms of your bad experience with the second principal, what did that look like?
Yeah. It's hard to even talk about, because I feel like people are going to hear this and be like, there must be something wrong with Hannah, because this keeps happening to her. I think I just got extremely unlucky, because I have never had a problem with a boss before or after these two principals, and I haven't had problems with parents. I haven't had problems with students. I have healthy relationships with my friends and family. But I started thinking, like, what the hell is wrong with me that this keeps happening to me, which I think was like part of the traumaticness of it. Was it made me question so much myself as a person. Like, there must be something very wrong with me, and I can't see it, but other people can see it. Because she came in, and she immediately came in and just started like doing weird things. Like, she changed everyone's grade level. She moved me from 5th grade to kindergarten.
What?
She just changed things around and made everyone all discombobulated and like confused.
Yeah.
But because of our previous principal, who was so unprofessional, this woman dressed neatly. She smiled. She had credentials. She was well spoken, whereas our other principal, had none of those things. She was kind of a mess. Like, she looked messy. She acted messy. The way she spoke was strange. But this principal was a lot more polished, and so she seemed very professional.
Right.
But she targeted me out of nowhere. She pulled me into her office when it was time for my evaluation, and she had barely even observed me in my classroom. She had been in my room like once, I think, and said that all these people are coming to me on a weekly basis saying how awful you are to work with.
What?
Yeah, and how you are so rude and saying hurtful things and you refuse to cooperate. And she said 5 people came and talked to me just this week. And I was self-contained, which means I taught every subject by myself. And I was the only Spanish-speaking teacher. So I really didn't collaborate much with anybody because I was the only person at my school doing my job. So I was very confused about who she could even be talking about, because I didn't even interact with 5 people in a week,
Yeah.
So I was like, oh my gosh, I believed her because I hadn't had any issues with her until then. I was like, can I please know what they said and who it was? I would love to sit down and like apologize if I said something wrong, or clear up the misunderstanding. Um, and as teachers, if 2 kids in our class are having an issue, we talk to them separately to get both of their stories, then we sit down together, we hash things out. Usually it's a misunderstanding. We apologize if needed, we shake hands, we move on. And she wouldn't afford me that respect, that courtesy, She just said, "Oh, well, I'm not going to tell you who those people were, and I'm not going to tell you what they said." She didn't tell me a single specific thing that they said. Like, it was just, it very much made it sound like she made it up or it was rumors. And I hadn't had any problems with coworkers until then. I had never had a negative interaction with a coworker. So it was just so weird. But I was like, there's something about me, I guess, that's really rubbing people the wrong way. There has to be. And so she put me on a performance improvement plan, which is like a huge, shameful thing for a teacher. Like, anytime anything bad happens, people are like, well, at least you're not on a performance improvement plan. I was like,
Right.
well, I am actually.
Yeah.
Like, it's something they only do for very bad teachers. So that was very embarrassing to have to do that. But I did not trust her at that point. I really felt like she was making things up. And so I requested to have a third party in every meeting with her. And I didn't let her talk to me without someone else present, because
I'm
she
sure
just
that only
made
exacerbated things, right?
Yeah, she, she kept on being who she was, but I went along with her little performance improvement plan, and I read the stuff she wanted me to do, and I did what she wanted me to do. I did file a grievance against her with HR, but that went nowhere. And then after that year, she left.
So you ended up leaving teaching after that, right?
I stuck it out for 2 more years at that school because there was a law at the time that if you work 5 years for a Title I school, which is a low-income school, then you'll have part of your student loans forgiven.
Okay.
And so I really wanted to stick it out so I could get that. But I actually ended up leaving after 4.5 years. Because even though the next principal I got was better, things were so toxic at that particular school. And I had special needs students who were getting no support in my classroom. I had no training. I requested training. I requested support. I didn't get it. And so I actually left because I felt like I was hurting the students because I wasn't able to help this child in my class who had special needs. I felt like I had to choose between helping him and helping the rest of my class. And I couldn't do it, Yeah. I couldn't choose. I felt like I really needed to support all my kids, and I couldn't do that.
Yeah,
in
that's a
that
lot of weight to
situation.
bear.
Yeah. And then I had been applying for jobs like nonstop throughout these 5 years. But you know, I hadn't gotten anything. And then finally, after 4.5 years, I got a really wonderful job opportunity. And so I was like, you know what? It was even a pay cut, but I was like, you know what? This is my ticket to get out of here and to get out of teaching.
Yeah.
And I swore I would never go back to teaching again. I sold or got rid of all my teaching stuff, everything. I was like, I'm never coming back to this career. And I did. I came back.
I mean, I'm sure at that point, after all that you had gone through, that you probably wanted to leave teaching behind completely and just get a fresh start in something else.
Yes, and I'm very, very glad that I left and took a break and did something else. It was really good for me. It helped me come back.
What did you end up doing?
So I worked at a nonprofit in Austin, and I was a child care director. Because I love working with parents and kids, and so it was like a wonderful job for me, and I got opportunity to be a director and manage people and hire, and so I ran a whole program.
What was the focus of the nonprofit?
It was a children's shelter and women's shelter, and so I worked with all kinds of populations, diverse populations, which was really cool. And I got to take a child care center that was kind of having a hard time staying afloat, and I got to turn things around and make them succeed. So
that's awesome.
It was very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it a lot. And it was good for me to get a break from teaching and experience the professional world outside of education.
Yeah.
Because education is so different than the professional world in other places.
Yeah, and I'm sure your experience was also so different, like such a different field of work while still being somewhat adjacent to what you had been already doing.
Yeah. Yeah, the fact that I got to work with kids, but I could go to the bathroom when I wanted to. I could take...
It's big.
Yeah, it was huge. I could take a lunch break,
Yeah.
It was amazing. Like the freedom I felt after those 5 years was incredible. I was like, oh, this is how other people work. Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. What led you to choose to go back into teaching?
It was a mixture of things. I really, really love working with kids, and I missed being in the classroom. Number one was that program unfortunately had to close because it was grant funded and the funding ran out. And so I probably would have stayed there forever if not, because I loved it.
Yeah.
But the funding ran out, and they tried to keep me on in another position, which was very nice, but they kind of made the position up for me. And I didn't have much to do, and I felt like I was taking money from this wonderful nonprofit. So I was like, I've got to find something else, and I've got to do something meaningful. So I ended up exploring a few different things, but I went back to teaching because I felt like I could have the most impact with kids.
Yeah.
And it's also a job that allows you some time off in the summers and, the big holidays, so I could be with my own kids because I have my own 2 kids now. So
yeah. Was your experience better the second time around with teaching?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Much, much better. I think I had more confidence, coming back. I had now been a director of a program and managed people, and I had learned a lot and gained confidence professionally. So I wasn't this young, scared 22-year-old anymore.
Yeah.
And I had taught before, so I came into it, with a lot of experience. Excuse me. So it went much better. Yeah. And I ended up going to some schools, not perfect schools, but with leadership who were nice and respectful and treated their employees with kindness and dignity, and that made a big difference.
Yeah, I'm sure it made a world of difference.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed teaching a lot the second time around. It's been much better.
Yeah. You had mentioned throughout the conversation about going to therapy to explore your experiences with workplace bullying and then also the religious stuff. How did you find your therapist, and what has that experience been like for you?
So I had been thinking about going to therapist for a while. But during the pandemic, therapy kind of saw like a boom. Like a lot of people realized they wanted to see a therapist and had more time on their hands, I think.
Yeah.
And so I had a hard time finding someone. And then I found a therapist for my daughter because she was having struggles with anxiety. And the place where we ended up taking her also saw adults. And so my husband and I ended up seeing a therapist to kind of help us a little bit with some relationship issues. And we just absolutely loved our therapist and really connected with her.
Yeah.
And so I ended up starting to see her because I felt like she already knew me and I had a good trusting relationship with her. And I had a bad experience with therapy. And so I didn't want to start fresh. And so she agreed to see me. So that was exciting.
Can you talk about the bad experience?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So my husband and I tried seeing a marriage therapist when my daughter was first born. And our therapist basically called me a bitch in our first session.
Whoa.
So she was not very professional.
Yeah, that has some red flags.
Yeah, she completely took my husband's side and really did not listen to my side of the story and called me a bitch. And when I shared my side of the story very passionately, I actually made her cry and she realized she was wrong. But by then the damage had been done and we did not go back. So that was not fun.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And I had also been to a therapist before about, my issues with intimacy and everything, the purity culture stuff. And that therapist was just very odd and did things that made me feel very uncomfortable. So I just had a couple forays into therapy that were not good. So when I found this therapist that we connected with so well, I was like, I've got to hold on to this woman at every cost.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so important to have that feeling of trust, but then also connection with the therapist, because potentially this could be a very long journey. And, you want a good co-pilot for, exploring this stuff.
And it was amazing because I originally went to her to talk about the religious stuff, but she asked me, what's something that gives you anxiety? Because I have a lot of anxiety. And I told her every year when I start a new school year of teaching, I feel anxious.
Yeah.
And we started exploring it and I realized I just bawled the entire session and I'm not really a crier because she just was able to hone in on the fact that I had been feeling like a fraud for, 10 years.
Yeah.
And she just, I feel like I told her about the experience with bullying and being called a bitch and how I've always felt like people see me as someone that I don't feel like I am, or maybe I am a bitch, maybe I am this person that no one can get along with, like my principal said. And she just shocked me because she said, Hannah, I just don't see you that way. I don't see you as this aggressive person. And she meant it. She said, I don't see you like that at all. And it was so wonderful that someone who was a professional in human behavior, who I have been very honest with, who my husband has been honest with, actually looked at me and did not see me as this person that my principles and my religion made me seem,
Yeah, so validating.
Yes, very much so. Because Christianity is all about being this perfect person,
Right.
and telling you over and over and over that you better try to be perfect, but don't be cocky because you never actually will be perfect. And it's just constant loop of you are shitty,
Yeah.
that I grew up hearing. And then it got reinforced by my principals and just hearing a therapist say you're none of those things,
Yeah.
You're
absolutely.
not perfect, but you don't need to be perfect,
Mm-hmm.
Just her saying, she said to me, you can be good enough. And that blew my mind that I could be good enough,
Right.
I have a book called I'm Good Enough and I've read it to my students, but I never thought that could apply to me,
Yeah. Yeah. Have you, are there any other insights or things that you have found helpful in that journey so far? I know it's still relatively new for you.
Yeah. She really helped me realize that I need to set boundaries with people.
Yeah.
This whole both teaching and Christianity, funnily enough, demand perfection. Like teachers are not allowed to make mistakes. We're not allowed to forget a meeting or not fill out a spreadsheet or, not call a parent or accidentally cuss in front of our kids,
Mm-hmm.
Like because we work with kids, and I think because we're mainly women, we're supposed to uphold this image of like martyr, saint, mother, teacher, social worker. And Christianity demands the same things.
Yeah.
You need to be blameless. And I realized I don't have to be those things, and I can set boundaries with people. And when I have this, like, I don't have the ability to chill, and relax. I always feel like I need to go, 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 do. If I sit down and take time for myself, then like I'm being selfish, and, then I'm not living the life God wants. And I'm not doing enough for my students. I'm not doing enough for my kids. I'm not, it's this constant pressure. So the whole that I can be good enough, and also that I can set boundaries for myself, was amazing. Like she told me, focus on your classroom. That's your most important job. You don't need to be doing other people's jobs for them. You don't need to be taking on all this other extra stuff. You can be good enough for your students, and you can set boundaries and say, no, I'm just going to do my job and be good enough at my job.
Yeah.
So, and I noticed I've been able to set boundaries better with my kids, with, because as a mom, you often end up saying yes too much. And I feel like I've learned that it's good for my kids to see me set boundaries. It's good for my daughter to see
Absolutely.
that she can say no, and
Yeah.
that a mom and a woman does not need to serve every person's whim. I realize my daughter needs to see me do that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm not a parent, but I can relate to a lot of different aspects of that. And I think, especially if you grew up in a very strict, semi-oppressive system, it often translates to issues with boundaries as an adult. And it's something that I have also really struggled with. And learning about boundaries has been a real revelation, but also I think just broadly, there is very poor education and communication around how to have boundaries and what healthy boundaries look like. And I mean, in that same way, learning about it and being able to practice it and enforce it has been wonderful. Like it has really had so much benefit for my life, but it's still also something where I'm still feeling it out. And it's like, oh, am I being too strict with my boundaries? Am I being too loose? Like there's still that fine tuning and that calibration and kind of like that second guessing, because I have spent a lot more of my life not doing it than doing it, and it's still very much a learning experience.
Yeah, definitely. I had never like had anyone talk to me about boundaries before therapy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think it's something we're really taught as kids,
Yeah.
or we don't see it modeled for us a lot.
Yeah, most definitely. I think definitely the generation before us, it wasn't talked about, and if that generation didn't know about boundaries, they can't model it for us. So
Yeah.
I think it's something very definitely that we have to learn on our own, which
Yeah.
is unfortunate, but also I think raising people's awareness of that has a compounding effect onto the next generation, etc.
Yes. Yeah. I'm so glad that like mental health now is talked about, and it's not as taboo anymore.
Yeah.
Our counselor at school comes and gives lessons to the kids, talking about feelings and how all feelings are good. There's no such thing as a bad feeling. That's definitely not the case in Christianity. Greed, jealousy, anger, those are all bad feelings,
Yeah.
or were when I was growing up, but they're not. They're healthy and normal. and you have to learn how to feel those things appropriately and how to manage those feelings, but having them doesn't make you damaged or bad. And when she comes and gives lessons to my students, I'm just like, oh my gosh, if the generations before, if we and the generations before us could have heard these things, like how much strife in the world would have been avoided.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Like, I just love that there's a focus on that now, and people want to hear podcasts like this because we all, I think, have trauma in our own way.
For sure.
And it's so nice to hear from other people and how they've managed to deal with it,
Yeah, and especially in you talking about imposter syndrome, like that's also something that I have struggled with, and in having these conversations with people and also consuming similar content, it has been a real aha moment to go, oh, I'm not the only person who struggles with this, or there's not just one person, but many people out there who feel the same way about this as I do. And, that has been very comforting and just very educational in that same way.
Yeah. Yeah. The fact that there's names for things like imposter syndrome, you know? Yeah. They're like, we're naming things and we're talking about them, and we're not pretending like they don't exist, you know?
Yeah, and I'm also very optimistic about the next generation because they have this awareness of these mental health issues, but then also it seems much more commonplace now to have some sort of relationship with a therapist, and that has a compounding effect outwards where the work that you have done on yourself ends up either also having benefit for the people around you, or people can look to you and see the healing or improvement that you have found by doing that work, and that inspires them to do their own work. And it creates this network effect that just travels outwards to hopefully create a better society for everybody.
Yeah, I'm never shy about talking to people about like what I'm learning in therapy. Like, I'll come back the next day and I'll be like, yeah, I talked about this in therapy and I learned this and that,
Yeah.
And, I'm like happy to share because I think it's amazing. Like, the things she says are simple, but they're not things I've ever been told before. So, yeah.
That's awesome. So, Hannah, we are pretty much at time, and I wanted to thank you for showing up today and the candor and the vulnerability that you displayed in sharing your story. I think this has been really awesome, and I think a lot of people will get a lot of value from this conversation.
I hope so. I hope people find it helpful. And thank you for having me, and thanks for doing this podcast.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Hannah.